Millionaire was in a restaurant when a poor girl told him, "Please marry my mother, she is all I have left," without knowing that he had been a widower for 10 years. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The rain drummed against the windows of Romano's, the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Manhattan. James Mitchell sat alone at his usual corner table, the same one he'd occupied every Tuesday evening for the past 10 years. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across his weathered face as he stared absently at the untouched plate of lobster before him. At 45, James commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. His steel-gray eyes had negotiated billion-dollar deals, and his steady hands had built an empire from nothing. But tonight, like every Tuesday for the past decade, those same hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine glass. "Rebecca would have loved this rain," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the soft jazz playing in the background. The empty chair across from him seemed to echo with her absence. The other diners gave him respectful distance. Everyone knew James Mitchell's story, the tech mogul who'd lost his beloved wife in a car accident exactly 10 years ago, and who never quite found his way back to the land of the living. That's when she appeared. A tiny figure in a worn pink dress approached his table with determined steps that seemed far too confident for someone so small. Her blonde hair was pulled into pigtails with mismatched ribbons, and her sneakers squeaked against the marble floor. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as this 6-year-old girl walked straight up to the most powerful man in the room. "Excuse me, sir," Emma said, her voice clear and unwavering despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Her blue eyes met his directly, showing no fear of the intimidating figure before her. James looked up, startled. Children were rare in Romano's, and this one was approaching him with purpose. "Please," Emma continued, her small hands clasped together in front of her. "I need you to marry my mom." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Conversations at nearby tables stopped. Even the waiters paused mid-step. James blinked, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Emma took a deep breath, as if she'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "My mom, she's all I have left in this world. And I think you might need someone too." Her innocent observation hit James like a physical blow. How could this child see what he'd spent 10 years trying to hide? "She's working 2 jobs to keep us together," Emma continued, glancing toward the kitchen where her mother Sarah was frantically managing orders as a temp worker. "She cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping. She's tired and scared, and she deserves someone who will take care of her the way she takes care of me." James felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built brick by brick over 10 years of grief. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "I don't even know your mother." Emma smiled then, a bright expression that transformed her entire face. "That's okay. I know enough about both of you. You sit here every Tuesday, and you never eat your food. You're sad, just like my mom. But maybe you could be sad together, and then maybe you wouldn't have to be sad anymore." Before James could respond, a woman's panicked voice cut through the restaurant. Emma, where are you?" Sarah burst through the kitchen doors, her server's apron stained and her face flushed with worry. When she spotted her daughter standing beside the most notorious table in the restaurant, her eyes went wide with horror. The moment James saw Sarah, really saw her, everything changed. She wasn't just beautiful, she radiated the same warmth that seemed to flow from her daughter. But he could also see the exhaustion Emma had mentioned, the weight of someone carrying far too much alone. Their eyes met across the dim restaurant, and James felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years, the flutter of possibility. Sarah rushed toward their table, her heart pounding with embarrassment and fear. Working at Romano's was supposed to be invisible, slip in through the kitchen, serve the elite clientele, collect her paycheck, and disappear. The last thing she needed was her 6-year-old daughter approaching the most influential man in the city. "Emma, what are you doing?" Sarah whispered urgently as she reached the table, her hands shaking as she grabbed her daughter's shoulders. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Mitchell." She wandered off from the kitchen. "It won't happen again." James stood slowly, his imposing frame unfolding to its full 6'2" height. But instead of the anger Sarah expected, his expression was unreadable, almost curious. "Actually," James said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "Emma and I were having quite an interesting conversation." He looked down at the little girl who was still standing between them with unwavering confidence. "She was telling me about someone very special." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Whatever she said, I'm sure she didn't mean to bother you. Emma, we need to go back to the kitchen right now." "But Mom," Emma protested. "I was just trying to help." You always say that good things happen to people who are brave enough to ask for them. The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. Those were the exact words she'd whispered to Emma 3 months ago when they'd been served an eviction notice. The same words she'd used to give her daughter hope when Sarah herself had none left. James watched the exchange with growing fascination. He could see the pride and desperation warring in Sarah's eyes, the way she held herself with dignity despite her obvious exhaustion. There was something about this woman that reminded him of strength he'd forgotten existed. Please, James said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Sit with me for a moment. Sarah glanced nervously toward the kitchen. I can't. I'm working, and if the manager sees me sitting with a customer, I own a significant stake in this restaurant, James said matter-of-factly. I don't think anyone will object. The revelation stunned Sarah into silence. She'd known James Mitchell was wealthy, but she hadn't realized the extent of his influence. She looked down at Emma, who was practically vibrating with excitement. 5 minutes, Sarah said finally, settling reluctantly into the chair. Then we really do need to get back to work. James poured water from the crystal pitcher into an empty glass and slid it across to Sarah. Emma tells me you're working 2 jobs. 3, actually, Sarah corrected, then immediately regretted the admission. But we're doing fine. We don't need charity. I wasn't offering charity, James replied. I was making conversation. There's a difference. Emma climbed into the chair beside her mother, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor. Mr. Mitchell, do you have any kids? The question visibly affected James. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might not answer. No, he said finally. I don't. Did you ever want any? Emma pressed, completely oblivious to the pain her innocent question was causing. Sarah started to intervene, but James held up a gentle hand. Very much, he admitted. My wife and we talked about it often. What happened to her? Emma asked with the directness only children possess. Emma! Sarah gasped, mortified by her daughter's boldness. But James didn't seem offended. Instead, he looked directly at Emma with something approaching respect. She died in an accident 10 years ago. Emma's expression grew thoughtful. That's why you're sad. Just like my mom is sad about my daddy. Sarah's breath caught. Emma rarely talked about David, who died of cancer when Emma was only 4. The fact that she was making these connections, seeing these parallels, both amazed and terrified Sarah. Yes, James said simply. That's exactly why I'm sad. For a moment, the 3 of them sat in comfortable silence, bound together by loss and the strange wisdom of a 6-year-old girl who saw the world more clearly than the adults around her. Maybe, Emma said finally, you could try being happy together. Just to see what it feels like. Before either adult could respond, the restaurant manager appeared at their table, his face flushed with anxiety. Mr. Mitchell, I'm terribly sorry about this disturbance. Sarah, you're needed in the kitchen immediately. The spell was broken. Sarah stood quickly, pulling Emma with her. Thank you for being so kind, she said to James. Come on, Emma. We've taken up enough of Mr. Mitchell's time. As they walked away, James called after them. Sarah. She turned back, her heart racing. What's your last name? Bennett, she replied. Sarah Bennett. James nodded slowly. It was very nice to meet you, Sarah Bennett. And you too, Emma. As Sarah disappeared into the kitchen with her daughter, James remained standing beside his table, watching the space where they'd been. For the first time in 10 years, the empty chair across from him didn't feel quite so empty. But in the kitchen, Sarah's supervisor was waiting with a very different expression than the one she'd hoped to see. Sarah, what the hell were you thinking? Marcus Rivera, the night manager, grabbed Sarah's arm the moment she entered the kitchen. His grip was firm enough to leave marks, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd been looking for a reason to assert his power. It wasn't planned, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady while Emma stayed close to her side. Emma just wandered off. Mr. Mitchell was actually very understanding about it. Understanding? Marcus laughed harshly. Do you have any idea who that man is? James Mitchell doesn't understand anything. He destroys people for sport. The fact that you're still employed right now is nothing short of a miracle. Sarah bit back her response. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not when they were already 3 weeks behind on rent and Emma needed new shoes before school started. The temp agency had been clear. One complaint from Romano's and she'd be blacklisted from every high-end establishment in the city. It won't happen again, Sarah said firmly. Emma, come with me. But as they walked toward the staff break room, Sarah could feel Marcus's eyes following them, calculating. She'd seen that look before, the expression of a man who'd found leverage and was deciding exactly how to use it. The break room was barely large enough for a small table and 2 chairs, but it was the only place in the restaurant where Emma could sit safely while Sarah worked. Sarah had cleared it with the day manager weeks ago, explaining that her usual babysitter had cancelled and she couldn't afford to miss a shift. "Mommy," Emma said as Sarah helped her out of her jacket. "Mr. Mitchell seemed really nice. Why is Marcus mad?" Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her daughter's face. How could she explain the complex world of class and power to a 6-year-old? How could she make Emma understand that their brief moment of connection with James Mitchell was exactly the kind of thing that could destroy their carefully balanced life? "Sometimes," Sarah said carefully, "important people prefer to be left alone. We need to respect that." "But he didn't seem like he wanted to be left alone," Emma protested. "He seemed lonely. Like you when you think I'm not watching." The observation cut deep. Sarah had tried so hard to shield Emma from her struggles, but children saw everything. They absorbed the tension, the late-night tears, the carefully hidden anxiety that came with living one paycheck away from disaster. "Baby," Sarah whispered, pulling Emma into a tight hug. "I need you to promise me something. No more talking to customers, okay? I know you were trying to help, but it could get us both in trouble." Emma nodded solemnly. "I promise, Mommy. But can I ask you something?" "What's that?" "Do you think Daddy would want you to be happy again?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. David had been dead for 2 years, but Emma still talked about him as if he might walk through the door at any moment. Sarah had encouraged it at first, thinking it was healthy for Emma to maintain that connection. But lately, she wondered if she was doing her daughter a disservice by not helping her move forward. "Daddy loved us both very much," Sarah said finally. "And yes, I think he'd want us to be happy. But happiness isn't always about finding someone else, Emma. Sometimes it's about being grateful for what we have." "But you cry at night," Emma said matter-of-factly. "I hear you sometimes. And you work so hard, but we're still always worried about money. Maybe if you had someone to help, Emma, life isn't that simple." Sarah began, but she was interrupted by a knock on the break room door. Marcus stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Sarah, I need to speak with you. Privately." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Emma, stay here and color in your book, okay? I'll be right back." In the hallway, Marcus leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "Look, I like you, Sarah. You're a good worker, and you don't cause problems. Usually." "But?" Sarah prompted, knowing there was more coming. "But what happened tonight can't happen again. Mr. Mitchell may have seemed friendly, but men like him don't forget. If he decides you're a problem, it won't just be your job here that's at risk. His influence reaches everywhere in this industry." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it would be better if you found alternative arrangements for your daughter. Bringing her here was always supposed to be temporary." The words felt like a death sentence. Sarah's daytime job at the grocery store barely covered their basic expenses. The evening shifts at Romano's were what kept them afloat. Without both incomes, they'd be homeless within a month. "Please," Sarah said, hating the desperation in her own voice. "She's not a problem. She stays in the break room, she doesn't bother anyone. Tonight was a one-time thing." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "Tell you what. I'll give you 2 weeks to figure something else out. After that, she can't come here anymore. And Sarah? If anything like tonight happens again, you're both gone immediately. Understood?" Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As Marcus walked away, she leaned against the wall and tried to steady her breathing. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks to find a babysitter she couldn't afford or a better job that didn't exist. When she returned to the break room, Emma looked up from her coloring book with bright, hopeful eyes. "Is everything okay, Mommy?" Sarah forced a smile. "Everything's fine, baby. Everything's going to be just fine." But as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter with James Mitchell had set something in motion that she couldn't control. And in a life that was already hanging by a thread, that terrified her more than anything. James sat in his penthouse office at 2 a.m., the city sprawling beneath him like a circuit board of lights. The untouched plate of food from Romano's had been replaced by an untouched glass of whiskey. His ritual of not consuming had simply transferred locations. He couldn't stop thinking about them. Emma's fearless blue eyes, so reminiscent of another pair he'd once known. Sarah's quiet dignity in the face of obvious struggle. The way they looked at him not as James Mitchell the billionaire, but as simply a man who needed kindness. The photographs on his desk caught the lamplight, casting shadows across Rebecca's smile. She'd been gone for exactly 10 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Not that he was counting. What would you think of them, Becca? He whispered to the largest photo, their wedding picture, where Rebecca's laugh was frozen in eternal joy. Would you tell me I'm being foolish for thinking about a woman I've known for exactly 27 minutes? The apartment remained silent, but James could almost hear Rebecca's voice in his memory. She'd always had an opinion about everything, especially when it came to matters of the heart. Life is for the living, James, she told him once when they'd attended the funeral of a friend. Don't you dare waste yours grieving for me when I'm gone. But he had wasted it. 10 years of existing rather than living, of going through the motions while his heart remained as frozen as that moment when the police officer had appeared at his door with news that would shatter his world. James opened his laptop and did something he hadn't done in years. He researched someone for personal rather than business reasons. Sarah Bennett's digital footprint was minimal, which told a story in itself. A few social media profiles that hadn't been updated in months, mostly pictures of Emma at playgrounds and school events. No mention of a husband, but James found an obituary for David Bennett, aged 31, survived by his wife Sarah and daughter Emma. The details were sparse, but James filled in the gaps easily. Young couple, probably married right out of college. David's death from cancer would have left them with medical bills that insurance didn't cover. Sarah would have been forced to rebuild her entire life while raising a small child alone. It was a story James knew intimately, though from a different angle. Sudden loss. The way grief could hollow you out until you were just a shell going through familiar motions. The difference was that James had money to cushion his fall, while Sarah had been forced to keep fighting just to survive. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Board meeting moved to 9 a.m. Merger documents need review tonight. James stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone aside without responding. The merger could wait. For the first time in a decade, he had something more important to think about. He found himself wondering what Emma was doing right now. Was she asleep in whatever small apartment they could afford? Did she have her own room, or did she share with her mother? The thought of that brave little girl going without basic necessities made something fierce stir in James's chest. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Mitchell? I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but there's a call from Romano's. They said it was urgent. James frowned. Put it through. Mr. Mitchell, this is Marcus Rivera, the night manager at Romano's. I hope I'm not calling too late. What's this about, Marcus? Well, sir, it's about the incident tonight with our temp worker. I wanted to assure you that we've handled the situation appropriately. The employee in question has been given strict instructions, and we've implemented new policies to ensure nothing like this happens again. Something cold settled in James's stomach. What exactly are you telling me? The woman, Sarah Bennett, won't be bringing her child to work anymore. I've made it clear that any further disruptions will result in immediate termination. I thought you should know that we take customer privacy very seriously. James felt anger rising in his chest, not at Sarah or Emma, but at the assumption that he'd wanted them punished. Mr. Rivera, did I at any point express dissatisfaction with Ms. Bennett or her daughter? There was a pause. Well, no, sir, but you assumed incorrectly, James said, his voice taking on the steel that had made him legendary in boardrooms. Ms. Bennett and her daughter were no trouble to me whatsoever. In fact, they brightened my evening considerably. I see. Should I perhaps reconsider the policies we've put in place? James considered this carefully. Getting directly involved would draw attention to Sarah and Emma, possibly making their situation worse. But doing nothing felt like abandoning them, and he'd done enough abandoning for one lifetime. What I think, James said slowly, is that good employees who work hard and treat customers with respect should be valued, not threatened. I trust you'll keep that in mind moving forward. Of course, Mr. Mitchell. Absolutely. After ending the call, James sat back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. He was already more involved than he'd intended to be, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's simple request had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long. His eyes fell on Rebecca's photo again. She's not you, Becca, he said quietly. And maybe that's exactly what I need. But even as he spoke the words, James felt the familiar weight of guilt settling over him. Was it betrayal to feel attracted to another woman? Was it foolish to consider opening his heart again when he knew exactly how much it could hurt to lose someone you loved? The questions followed him to bed, where he lay awake until dawn, thinking about Blue Eyes, both the ones he'd lost and the ones he'd found. The next morning brought complications Sarah hadn't anticipated. She'd managed exactly 3 hours of sleep before Emma bounded into her room, chattering excitedly about Mr. James, and whether they might see him again. "Emma, honey," Sarah said as she helped her daughter get dressed for their neighbor Mrs. Chin to watch her. "I need you to understand something important. What happened last night was special. But it probably won't happen again." "Why not?" Emma asked, her face scrunching in confusion. "He seemed nice. And lonely. Really, really lonely." Sarah paused, unbuttoning Emma's shirt. Her daughter's emotional intelligence never ceased to amaze her. At 6 years old, Emma could read people in ways that took most adults decades to learn. "Sometimes," Sarah said carefully, "people from different worlds aren't meant to be in each other's lives. Mr. Mitchell lives in a very different world from ours. But worlds can change," Emma said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "Like when we moved from our old apartment to this one. Different worlds, same us." The observation hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. Emma was right. They had changed worlds when David died. From middle-class comfort to paycheck survival. From a house with a garden to a studio apartment above a Korean restaurant. The change had been devastating, but they'd survived it. But this was different. This was about a man so far above their station that even thinking about him felt dangerous. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the temp agency. "New assignment available. High-end catering event tonight. Triple overtime pay. Interested?" Triple overtime would mean the difference between making rent and facing eviction. Sarah texted back immediately, "Yes." The response came within minutes. "Great. Event is at the Mitchell Foundation Gala. Black tie charity event. Report to Grand Central Ballroom at 4 p.m. for setup." Sarah's blood ran cold. The Mitchell Foundation, as in James Mitchell. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. She called the agency immediately. "Is there any other assignment available tonight? Anything at all?" "Sorry, honey," came the tired voice of Linda, the dispatcher. "This is the only thing we've got. Big event, lots of overtime opportunities. Most of our girls would kill for this assignment." Sarah closed her eyes. She couldn't afford to turn down triple overtime, but the thought of facing James Mitchell again, especially in his own environment, surrounded by his own people, made her stomach churn with anxiety. "I'll take it," she said finally. "Great! And Sarah? This is a high-profile event. Best behavior, okay? We can't afford any complications with the Mitchell Foundation. They're one of our biggest clients." After ending the call, Sarah sat on her tiny couch and tried to process what had just happened. In less than 12 hours, she'd gone from hoping never to see James Mitchell again to knowing she'd be serving at his charity gala. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd be there as part of the invisible workforce that made such events possible. Black uniform, silver tray, trained to be seen but not noticed. The perfect position to observe James Mitchell in his natural habitat without any risk of the kind of personal interaction that had terrified her so much the night before. At least, that's what she told herself. By afternoon, Sarah had dropped Emma at Mrs. Chen's apartment with strict instructions not to mention anything about Mr. Mitchell, and had arrived at the Grand Central Ballroom for setup. The space was being transformed into something that belonged in a magazine: crystal chandeliers, white orchids everywhere, and a small orchestra tuning instruments in the corner. "You're Sarah Bennett?" A severe-looking woman with a clipboard approached her. "I'm Catherine Walsh, event coordinator. You'll be working the VIP section tonight. High-profile guests, including Mr. Mitchell himself. I trust that won't be a problem." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "No problem at all." "Good. The Mitchell Foundation events are always flawless, and we intend to keep it that way. You'll be briefed on the guest list momentarily, but the most important thing to remember is discretion. These people value their privacy above all else." As Catherine walked away, Sarah caught sight of a large photograph being hung near the entrance, a professional shot of James Mitchell shaking hands with the mayor, with text underneath reading, 10 years of the Rebecca Mitchell Foundation, honoring her legacy of caring." The foundation was named after his dead wife. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. This wasn't just any charity gala. This was a memorial to the woman James had loved and lost. She was about to spend the evening serving drinks and canapes at what amounted to a shrine to Rebecca Mitchell's memory. The weight of how inappropriate her daughter's request had been hit her with fresh force. Emma had asked a grieving widower to marry her mother at an event celebrating his dead wife's charitable legacy. The mortification was almost unbearable. "Sarah?" Catherine's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "The guests are beginning to arrive. Take your position at the VIP bar." As Sarah walked toward her assigned station, she caught sight of herself in one of the ballroom's mirrors. Black uniform, hair pulled back severely, silver name tag reading simply Sarah. She looked like exactly what she was: hired help. Anonymous. Forgettable.it was perfect camouflage, she told herself. James Mitchell would never even notice her in this crowd of New York's elite, but as the ballroom filled with guests in designer gowns and custom tuxedos, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something far more complicated than a simple catering job. And when James Mitchell walked through the ballroom doors, looking devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, Sarah realized with growing dread that her camouflage might not be as perfect as she'd hoped. He was scanning the room with those penetrating gray eyes, and Sarah had the terrifying suspicion that he was looking for someone specific. James entered the Grand Central Ballroom with the practiced ease of someone who'd attended hundreds of such events, but tonight felt different. For the first time in 10 years, he wasn't simply going through the motions of the Rebecca Mitchell Foundation Gala. Tonight he was searching the crowd for a familiar face. He'd spent the day telling himself he was being ridiculous. The chances of Sarah Bennett working this particular event were slim to none. Even if she was here, she'd be working, and he'd be surrounded by board members, donors, and politicians. There would be no opportunity for the kind of personal conversation that had kept him awake all night. But as he moved through the receiving line, shaking hands and accepting condolences and congratulations in equal measure, James found his attention divided. Part of him was present for his obligations, but another part was conducting a careful sweep of the waitstaff. James! Eleanor Whitmore, the Foundation's board chair, appeared at his elbow with a champagne flute and her signature political smile. Wonderful turnout tonight. I think we might exceed last year's fundraising totals. Rebecca would be pleased. James replied automatically, the response he'd perfected over a decade of similar conversations. She would indeed. And James, I wanted to mention that the Patterson family is here tonight. Victoria Patterson specifically. She's been asking about you. James nodded politely while internally suppressing a groan. Victoria Patterson was the daughter of one of the Foundation's major donors, recently divorced, and apparently in the market for a new husband with the right social connections. Eleanor had been none too subtly trying to orchestrate an introduction for months. Perhaps later, James said diplomatically. I should make my rounds first. Eleanor's smile tightened slightly. Of course. But James, you know Rebecca wouldn't want you to remain alone forever. She'd want you to find happiness again. The presumption in Eleanor's voice, her assumption that she knew what Rebecca would have wanted, made something cold settle in James's chest. But before he could respond, he caught sight of a familiar figure across the room. Sarah stood behind the VIP bar, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her movements precise and professional as she prepared drinks for the gathering crowd. She wore the same black uniform as all the other servers, but to James, she might as well have been spotlighted. Excuse me, Eleanor, James said, not bothering to hide the dismissal in his tone. I see someone I need to speak with. As he moved toward the bar, James was acutely aware of the attention his movement drew. Conversations paused as he passed, people turned to follow his progress, and he could feel the speculation beginning to build. James Mitchell didn't deviate from protocol at Foundation events. He certainly didn't approach the service staff. Sarah looked up as he approached, and James saw the exact moment recognition hit her. Her eyes widened slightly, and her hand stilled on the cocktail shaker she'd been preparing to use. Mr. Mitchell, she said, her voice professionally neutral. What can I get for you this evening? Scotch, neat, James replied, then added quietly. And an explanation for why you didn't tell me you'd be working tonight. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the bottle of top-shelf scotch. I didn't know you'd be here, she said, equally quietly. I mean, I knew it was your foundation, but I assumed you'd have people running things for you. This was my wife's foundation, James said, accepting the glass she handed him. I've never missed a gala. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Sarah's face went pale as the full significance of the evening hit her. Oh God, she whispered. Last night, when Emma asked you to, this is about your wife, isn't it? This whole thing is a memorial to her. James nodded slowly. The foundation funds children's hospitals and family support services. Rebecca always believed that helping families stay together was the most important work anyone could do. Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back quickly. I'm so sorry. If I'd known, if Emma had understood what she was asking, don't apologize, James said firmly. What Emma asked for isn't something to be sorry about. Before Sarah could respond, a new voice cut through their conversation. James, there you are. Victoria Patterson appeared beside him, her hand immediately settling possessively on his arm. She was undeniably beautiful, tall, blonde, elegant in the way that came from generations of breeding and expensive finishing schools. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Victoria's eyes swept over Sarah dismissively, taking in the uniform and the name tag, categorizing her as part of the scenery. "Could we get some champagne?" she asked Sarah without really looking at her. "The Dom Perignon, not whatever you're serving the general crowd." Sarah's jaw tightened, but her voice remained professionally neutral. "Of course. Right away." As Sarah turned to retrieve the champagne, Victoria leaned closer to James. "Darling, Eleanor says the silent auction is going wonderfully. Apparently your donation of the weekend in the Hamptons is generating quite a bidding war." James barely heard her. He was watching Sarah's reflection in the mirror behind the bar, seeing the controlled hurt in her expression as she prepared Victoria's champagne. The contrast between the two women was stark, one expecting to be served, the other dedicated to serving others even when it cost her dignity. "Here you are," Sarah said, offering Victoria the champagne flute with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Victoria took the glass without acknowledgement, already turning her attention back to James. "I was thinking we should dance later. The orchestra is supposed to play some wonderful Sinatra numbers after dinner." But James wasn't looking at Victoria. He was looking at Sarah, who was trying very hard to become invisible while remaining professional. The same woman who worked 3 jobs to support her daughter. The same woman whose 6-year-old had seen his loneliness so clearly that she'd risked everything to try to fix it. "Actually," James said, his voice carrying clearly across the immediate area, "I was hoping to continue my conversation with Ms. Bennett here. We were discussing some foundation business." The lie was smooth and completely believable, but it had the immediate effect of elevating Sarah's status from invisible servant to someone worthy of James Mitchell's personal attention. Victoria's eyes sharpened with sudden interest, and James could see other guests beginning to take notice. "Foundation business?" Victoria repeated, her tone suggesting this was highly irregular. "Ms. Bennett has some valuable insights about family services," James continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "I'd like to hear more about her perspectives." Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear entirely, but James pressed on. He was crossing a line, he knew that. But for some reason, the line felt like exactly the right place to be. What he couldn't have anticipated was that his public attention to Sarah Bennett was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change everything, not just for him and Sarah, but for everyone who depended on maintaining the careful social order that governed their world. And across the ballroom, Eleanor Whitmore was already reaching for her phone, her expression suggesting that she had calls to make and damage to control. The photograph appeared in the New York Society pages 3 days later. James Mitchell, the city's most eligible widower, deep in conversation with an unnamed woman at his foundation gala. The caption read, "Mitchell Foundation Gala raises record $3.2 million. But who's the mystery woman capturing our most elusive bachelor's attention?" Sarah stared at the image on her phone screen while Emma ate cereal at their tiny kitchen table. In the photo, Sarah looked professional and composed, but anyone who knew what to look for could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful distance she was maintaining even while James leaned slightly toward her. She'd been naive to think their conversation would go unnoticed. "Mommy, you look pretty in that picture," Emma said, peeking over Sarah's shoulder. "Is that Mr. James?" "Yes, sweetheart. But remember what we talked about. This stays between us, okay?" Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Can we see him again soon?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. The temp agency. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk." Linda's voice was tight with stress. "I'm getting calls about you." "Lots of calls." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What kind of calls?" "Requests, mostly. High-end clients who saw that picture and want to book you specifically for their events. But also, some complaints. Apparently, some people think it was inappropriate for you to be photographed with Mr. Mitchell." "I didn't arrange to be photographed," Sarah said, feeling panic rising in her chest. "He approached me. I was just doing my job." "I know, honey. But perception is everything in this business. Look, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is you're suddenly in demand. I could book you solid for the next 6 months at premium rates. The bad news is that some of our regular clients are concerned about discretion." Sarah closed her eyes. She could lose the steady work that kept them afloat, or she could accept jobs that would put her constantly in James Mitchell's social circle. Both options felt like walking through a minefield. "What do you recommend?" Sarah asked. "Take the premium bookings while they're available. Make enough money to give yourself some breathing room. But Sarah? Be careful. Men like James Mitchell live in a different world, and people in that world don't like surprises. After ending the call, Sarah found Emma watching her with the too serious expression that appeared whenever adult problems leaked into their small apartment. Are we in trouble again? Emma asked. Sarah knelt down and pulled her daughter into a hug. No, baby. We're just navigating some changes. But even as she spoke the words, Sarah could feel the walls of their carefully controlled life beginning to shift in ways she couldn't predict or control. Later that morning, while Emma was at her summer program, Sarah received a text from an unknown number. This is James Mitchell. I hope the attention from the gala hasn't caused you any problems. If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to take you and Emma to lunch today. To apologize for putting you in an awkward position. Sarah stared at the message for 10 full minutes. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she should decline politely and maintain the distance that would keep them both safe. But another part of her, the part that had been dormant since David died, whispered that maybe Emma had been right. Maybe they were both tired of being sad alone. She typed and deleted a dozen responses before finally sending. Emma would love that. But somewhere private, please. The attention is already more than we're comfortable with. His response came immediately. My apartment. I'll cook. 1 p.m.? I promise it will be completely private. Sarah's hands shook as she typed back. Okay. What she didn't know was that across town, Eleanor Whitmore was sitting in her Upper East Side office, making phone calls and pulling strings that would turn their private lunch into something far more complicated than either James or Sarah could have imagined. Victoria, darling, Eleanor said into her phone. I think it's time we discuss your future with the foundation. And James's future, for that matter. James's penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park from the 42nd floor, but what struck Sarah most wasn't the view or the obvious wealth, it was how empty it felt. The furniture was expensive but impersonal, like a high-end hotel suite rather than a home where someone actually lived. Mr. James! Emma squealed when he opened the door, launching herself forward for a hug that he accepted with surprising grace. Hello, Emma, James said, genuinely smiling for what Sarah suspected was the first time in days. I hope you're hungry. I may have gone a bit overboard with lunch preparations. He led them into a kitchen that was larger than Sarah's entire apartment, where he'd clearly spent considerable effort preparing what he'd described as a simple meal. There were homemade sandwiches cut into neat triangles, fresh fruit arranged artfully on a platter, and what appeared to be homemade chocolate chip cookies cooling on a rack. You made cookies? Sarah asked, unable to hide her surprise. James had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Rebecca always said that any meal worth sharing should include something sweet. I haven't baked in 10 years. I wasn't sure they'd turn out. Emma was already examining the cookies with the serious attention of a 6-year-old connoisseur. They look perfect, she pronounced. Can I try one? After lunch, Sarah said automatically, then caught herself. I mean, if Mr. Mitchell says it's okay. I think we can make an exception, James said, handing Emma a still warm cookie. And please, both of you, call me James. As they ate lunch at his dining room table, Sarah found herself relaxing despite her better judgment. James was different here in his own space, less guarded, more human. He asked Emma about her summer program and listened intently to her detailed explanation of the art project she was working on. He asked Sarah about her other jobs without making her feel judged for needing them. I work at Riverside Grocery in the mornings, Sarah explained. It's steady work, and the manager is understanding about my schedule with Emma. The evening catering helps make ends meet. That's a lot, James observed. When do you sleep? Sarah shrugged. When Emma does. We manage. Mommy's tired a lot. Emma chimed in with characteristic honesty. Sometimes she falls asleep reading me stories. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, but James's expression was thoughtful rather than judgmental. Emma, James said carefully, would you like to see something special? He led them to what had clearly once been a nursery. The walls were painted a soft yellow, and there was a crib, a changing table, and shelves lined with children's books and toys. Everything was covered with sheets, as if it had been frozen in time. Rebecca and I were going to have a baby, James said quietly. We had everything ready. After she died, I just closed the door. Emma walked around the room with quiet reverence, touching the covered furniture gently. Were you going to love the baby a lot? She asked. Very much, James said, his voice thick with emotion. I think the baby would have been lucky, Emma said matter-of-factly. You're good at taking care of people. You took care of us today. Sarah watched James's face crumple slightly at Emma's innocent observation. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm gently. James, she said softly, you don't have to show us this if it's too painful. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. It's the first time in 10 years that this room hasn't felt like a tomb, he said. Emma's right. Rebecca and I would have loved our child very much. Just like you love Emma. The moment stretched between them, heavy with understanding and possibility. Sarah became acutely aware of how close they were standing, how James was looking at her like she was something precious and unexpected. Mommy! Emma's voice broke the spell. Can we stay here for dinner too? Sarah stepped back quickly. Emma, we've already taken up enough of James's time. Actually, James said, I was hoping you would stay. There's something I want to discuss with both of you. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What kind of something? James took a deep breath. I've been thinking about what Emma said that first night. About being sad together until we're not sad anymore. I know it sounds crazy, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. James, Sarah began, but he held up a gentle hand. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, he said. But I would like the chance to get to know you better. Both of you. Maybe we could start with dinner occasionally. Or I could help with Emma's school expenses. I know you're struggling, and I'd like to help. Sarah's pride flared immediately. I don't need charity. It wouldn't be charity, James said firmly. It would be friendship. And maybe, eventually, something more. The honesty in his voice made Sarah's heart race. But before she could respond, Emma piped up from across the room. Does this mean you might marry Mommy after all? Both adults turned to stare at her, and Emma grinned with the satisfaction of someone who just solved a very complicated puzzle. Emma! Sarah gasped, but James was looking at Sarah with an expression that made her breath catch. Maybe, he said quietly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. If your mother is brave enough to take a chance on a sad old widower. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. This wasn't how her life was supposed to go. She was supposed to work hard, raise Emma, and survive. She wasn't supposed to fall for billionaires who baked cookies and kept nurseries as shrines to their dead wives. But as she looked at James Mitchell, really looked at him, she saw not the intimidating businessman from the restaurant, but a man who was just as scared and hopeful as she was. I think, Sarah said slowly, that we're both too smart to make any big decisions based on one afternoon. James smiled, and Sarah realized it was the first completely genuine smile she'd seen from him. You're right, he said. We should probably have at least 2 afternoons before we start planning a wedding. Emma clapped her hands in delight, but Sarah felt a chill of premonition. They were playing with fire, and she had the distinct feeling that someone was about to get burned. Eleanor Whitmore had not become the chairwoman of New York's most prestigious charitable foundation by leaving important matters to chance. Sitting in her mahogany-paneled office 3 days after the gala, she reviewed her strategy with the cold calculation of a military general. The James Mitchell situation required delicate handling. For 10 years, she'd managed to keep him focused on the foundation's work while carefully managing his social interactions. James's grief had been useful. It made him malleable, predictable. A man lost in sorrow didn't ask uncomfortable questions about foundation finances or board decisions. But now there was Sarah Bennett to consider. Eleanor had done her research. Single mother, multiple jobs, deceased husband with substantial medical debt. The woman was exactly the kind of vulnerability that could compromise James's judgment, and by extension, the careful balance of power Eleanor had spent years constructing. Her first call was to Marcus Rivera at Romano's. Mr. Rivera, this is Eleanor Whitmore from the Mitchell Foundation. I believe we need to discuss one of your employees. Ms. Whitmore, how can I help you? Sarah Bennett has been causing some complications for Mr. Mitchell. I think it would be best if her employment at Romano's was reconsidered. There was a pause. Actually, Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Mitchell specifically asked me to ensure Ms. Bennett was treated well. Firing her might create problems. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. James was already protecting the woman. This was worse than she thought. I see. Well, perhaps there are other ways to address the situation. Her second call was to Victoria Patterson. Victoria, darling, I think it's time we discuss your future more seriously. James needs guidance right now, and I believe you're exactly the person to provide it. Has something happened? Victoria's voice sharpened with interest. Let's just say that James is making some poor decisions lately, and he needs friends who understand his best interests. Are you free for lunch tomorrow? Eleanor's third and most important call was to Harrison Cole, the Foundation's lead attorney and her most trusted ally on the board. Harry, we have a problem. James is becoming personally involved with someone completely inappropriate. I need to know what options we have to protect the Foundation's interests. What kind of involvement are we talking about? Harrison's voice was cautious. The kind that could lead to marriage if we don't intervene. Harry, this woman is a gold digger with a child. If she gets her claws into James, everything we've built could be at risk. Eleanor, you're talking about James's personal life. We can't we? Eleanor interrupted. James controls 60% of the Foundation's assets. His personal decisions directly impact our ability to serve the community. If he makes a mistake that compromises the Foundation's reputation or financial stability, thousands of families could suffer. It was a masterful argument, and Eleanor knew it. By framing her concerns in terms of charitable work and community service, she could justify almost any intervention as being for the greater good. What are you proposing? Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Research. Due diligence. If this woman has any skeletons in her closet, we need to know about them before James does something irreversible. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah was having her own crisis of conscience. She'd agreed to see James again, dinner the following evening, but every rational part of her brain was screaming warnings. Mrs. Chin, she said to her elderly neighbor who often watched Emma. Can I ask you something personal? Of course, dear. What's troubling you? If someone offered to help you, to make your life easier, but you weren't sure about their motives, what would you do? Mrs. Chin studied Sarah's face with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through enough to recognize the signs of a woman at a crossroads. Is this about the man Emma keeps talking about? The one who makes cookies? Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Let me ask you something, Mrs. Chin said gently. Are you afraid he's lying about his feelings, or are you afraid he's telling the truth? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the practical impossibilities of a relationship with James Mitchell that she hadn't acknowledged the deeper fear, that maybe Emma had been right, and they could find happiness together. What if I'm not enough? Sarah whispered. What if I'm just a temporary distraction from his grief? And what if you're exactly what he needs? Mrs. Chin countered. What if you're both brave enough to find out? That evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, her daughter looked up at her with serious eyes. Mommy, are you going to marry James? Emma, we've only known him for a week. But do you like him? Sarah considered lying, but Emma had an uncanny ability to detect deception. Yes, she said finally. I like him very much. And he likes you too. I can tell. How can you tell? Emma smiled with the confidence of someone who saw the world more clearly than the adults around her. Because he looks at you the same way Daddy used to. Like you're the most important person in the whole world. The observation made Sarah's heart ache with possibility and terror in equal measure. Because Emma was right, James did look at her that way. And for the first time in 2 years, Sarah was beginning to look at someone the same way in return. What none of them knew was that Eleanor Whitmore had just hired one of the city's most thorough private investigators to dig into Sarah Bennett's past. And what he would find in the coming days would threaten to destroy everything before it had a chance to begin. The investigation would uncover a secret that Sarah had buried so deeply she'd almost convinced herself it wasn't true. A secret that would change everything James thought he knew about the woman he was beginning to love. The private investigator's report landed on Eleanor Whitmore's desk exactly 1 week after she'd commissioned it. She opened the manila folder with the satisfaction of someone who'd known her instincts were correct. The first few pages contained exactly what she'd expected: confirmation of Sarah's financial struggles, details about her husband's medical bills, documentation of her employment history. But it was page 7 that made Eleanor smile with cold triumph. There, in black and white, was the information that would end James Mitchell's dangerous infatuation once and for all. Sarah Bennett hadn't just lost her husband to cancer. She'd lost him while she was pregnant with their second child, a pregnancy that had ended in a miscarriage during the same week David died. But that wasn't the devastating part. The devastating part was that David Bennett had died on the exact same day as Rebecca Mitchell, in the same hospital, from complications related to the same rare form of cancer. Sarah had been in the maternity ward losing her baby while James was in the ICU losing his wife. They'd shared the worst day of their lives without knowing it. Eleanor closed the folder and reached for her phone. This information, properly presented, would accomplish 2 things. It would prove to James that Sarah was keeping important secrets from him, and it would make any future relationship between them feel tainted by the strange coincidence of their shared tragedy. But Eleanor was too calculating to reveal her hand immediately. This information needed to be delivered at exactly the right moment for maximum impact. That moment came 3 days later, when James called an emergency board meeting to discuss expanding the foundation's scope to include more direct financial assistance for struggling families. James, Harrison Cole said carefully, this is a significant departure from Rebecca's original vision for the foundation. Are you sure this is the right direction? I'm certain, James replied, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire. There are families out there who need immediate help, not just long-term programs. Families like... He caught himself before saying Sarah's name, but Eleanor noticed the slip. Families like the Bennett family? Eleanor asked innocently. James's eyes sharpened. What do you know about the Bennett family? Perhaps the question is what you don't know about them, Eleanor replied, sliding the investigator's report across the conference table. I think you should read this before we continue. James opened the folder with growing wariness. Eleanor watched his face change as he read, confusion giving way to shock, then to something that looked like betrayal. This can't be right, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. I had it verified by 3 independent sources, Eleanor said gently. I'm sorry, James. I know this must be difficult. James stared at the report, his mind racing. Sarah's husband had died on February 23rd, the same day Rebecca died. They'd both been at Metropolitan General Hospital. While he'd been watching Rebecca slip away, Sarah had been losing both her husband and her unborn child just floors away. She never mentioned any of this, James said. Can you blame her? Victoria Patterson spoke up from across the table. She'd been conspicuously quiet during the meeting, but now her voice carried perfectly calibrated sympathy. The woman clearly saw an opportunity when she learned who you were. The coincidence is just too convenient. That's enough, James said sharply, but the doubt had been planted. James, Eleanor said, her voice soft with manufactured concern. I know you care about this woman. But you have to consider the possibility that she's been manipulating you from the beginning. How else do you explain her daughter approaching you so boldly that first night? The words hit James like physical blows. Emma's confident approach, Sarah's reluctance to accept his help, her insistence that she didn't need charity. What if it had all been an act? What if a desperate woman had coached her 6-year-old daughter to target the most vulnerable man in the restaurant? I need to speak with her, James said, standing abruptly. Is that wise? Harrison asked. If she's been deceiving you, confronting her directly could give her time to prepare more lies. But James was already walking toward the door. The meeting is adjourned. As the boardroom emptied, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. She'd planted exactly the right seeds of doubt. Now she just had to wait for them to grow. Across town, Sarah was getting Emma ready for bed, completely unaware that her carefully protected secrets had been exposed. She'd planned to tell James about David's connection to February 23rd eventually, but the timing had never felt right. How do you tell someone you're falling in love with that you shared the worst day of your life with them before you ever met? Emma was chattering about her day at summer camp when Sarah's phone rang. James's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah smiled as she answered. Hi, she said warmly. Emma was just asking if we could see you this weekend. Sarah. James's voice was different, cold, distant. We need to talk. Sarah's stomach dropped. What's wrong? I think you know. James, I don't understand. February 23rd, James said, and Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. David died on February 23rd, didn't he? At Metropolitan General Hospital. Sarah sank onto her couch, her hands trembling. James, let me explain. Explain what? That you've been lying to me from the beginning? That your daughter's request wasn't innocent at all. It wasn't like that, Sarah said desperately. Emma doesn't even know about the connection. I've never told her when David died. She was too young to remember the date. But you knew, James said. You knew from the moment you heard my name that we shared that day. Yes, Sarah whispered. But James, that's not why. I don't want to hear any more lies, James interrupted. I thought Emma was brave for approaching me. I thought you were different. But you're just like everyone else who sees $signs when they look at me. The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, watching Emma play with her dolls, completely oblivious to the fact that their brief taste of happiness had just been destroyed by the very secrets Sarah had been trying to protect them both from. What Sarah didn't know was that Eleanor Whitmore was already planning the next phase of her campaign, one that would ensure James Mitchell never looked at another woman the way he looked at Sarah Bennett. 3 weeks passed in a haze of hurt and confusion. Sarah threw herself into work with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun her own thoughts, picking up extra shifts at the grocery store and accepting every catering job the temp agency offered. Emma asked about James constantly until Sarah finally had to explain that they wouldn't be seeing him anymore. But why? Emma demanded with the persistence of a 6-year-old who sensed that the adults weren't telling her the whole truth. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, Sarah said carefully. And sometimes those disagreements can't be fixed. Did you have a fight? Something like that. But you love him, Emma said with startling directness. I can tell. Sarah's breath caught. Emma, and he loves you too. When he looked at you, he got the same happy sad face that you get when you talk about Daddy. The observation was so perceptive that Sarah had to turn away to hide her tears. Because Emma was right, she had fallen in love with James Mitchell, despite every reasonable objection her brain had raised. And losing him hurt in ways she hadn't expected. Meanwhile, James was discovering that righteous anger was a poor substitute for the warmth he'd felt with Sarah and Emma. His penthouse felt even emptier than before, and he found himself standing in the unused nursery for hours, remembering how natural Emma had looked in that space. Victoria Patterson had become a constant presence, invited by Eleanor to help James through this difficult period. She appeared at his office with lunch invitations, at his apartment with dinner suggestions, at foundation events as his unofficial companion. She was everything Sarah wasn't: polished, predictable, safe, and James felt absolutely nothing for her. You seem distracted tonight, Victoria said as they left yet another charity function. Are you still thinking about that woman? Her name is Sarah, James said quietly. James, darling, you have to move on. Eleanor showed me the investigator's report. The woman was clearly manipulating you. James stopped walking. What investigator's report? Victoria's face went pale. I thought you knew. Eleanor had her investigated. It's how she discovered the connection to your wife's death. Something cold and dangerous settled in James's chest. Eleanor hired an investigator? She was protecting you, Victoria said quickly. She was worried about the Foundation's reputation. James said nothing more during the car ride home, but his mind was racing. Eleanor had investigated Sarah without his knowledge or consent. She'd violated Sarah's privacy, invaded her past, and then used that information to destroy something precious. The next morning, James called an emergency board meeting. Eleanor, he said without preamble, you're fired. The room erupted in shocked murmurs, but James continued calmly. Your unauthorized investigation into a private citizen's background was completely inappropriate. Clean out your office. James, you're making a mistake, Eleanor said, her composure finally cracking. That woman, James interrupted, is someone whose privacy you violated for your own agenda. This meeting is over. As the board members filed out in stunned silence, Harrison Cole lingered. James, are you sure about this? Eleanor's been with the Foundation since Rebecca started it. Rebecca would be appalled by what Eleanor did, James said firmly. And frankly, so am I. But firing Eleanor didn't solve James's real problem. He'd accused Sarah of manipulation and lies, when the truth was that she'd simply been protecting herself and her daughter from exactly the kind of violation Eleanor had committed. He'd been wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. James spent the rest of the day trying to figure out how to apologize to someone he'd hurt so badly. Flowers seemed inadequate. A phone call felt cowardly. Showing up at her apartment might terrify her. Finally, he did the only thing that felt right. He went to Romano's. Marcus Rivera looked up nervously as James entered the restaurant. Mr. Mitchell! We weren't expecting you tonight. Is Sarah Bennett working? James asked. She doesn't work here anymore, Marcus admitted reluctantly. She quit about 2 weeks ago. James felt his heart sink. Did she say why? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. She said she needed to focus on other opportunities. But honestly, Mr. Mitchell, I think the attention from that newspaper photo made her uncomfortable. Some of the other staff were unkind about it. James closed his eyes. Sarah had lost her job because of him, because of the attention he'd brought to her life. She was probably working even harder now, struggling even more, all because he'd been too proud and too hurt to listen to her explanation. Do you know where she's working now? James asked. I heard she picked up more hours at Riverside Grocery, Marcus said. But Mr. Mitchell, maybe it's better to let her move on. She seemed pretty upset when she left. James nodded and turned to leave, but Marcus called after him. Mr. Mitchell? For what it's worth, she's a good person. One of the best we've ever had working here. And that little girl of hers, she talks about you like you hung the moon." The words followed James home, where he sat in his empty apartment and tried to figure out how to fix the biggest mistake of his life. What he didn't know was that Sarah was 3 blocks away, lying awake in her own bed, wondering if she'd done the right thing by walking away from the first man who'd made her feel alive since David died. And neither of them knew that Emma had been listening to more of their conversations than either adult realized, and that she was formulating a plan of her own to fix what the grown-ups had broken, because sometimes it takes a 6-year-old to remind adults that love is supposed to be brave, even when being brave is scary. Emma Bennett had heard enough adult conversations to know that sometimes grown-ups were too scared to fix their own mistakes. So on a crisp Saturday morning, while her mother was working an extra shift at Riverside Grocery, Emma made a decision that would have terrified Sarah if she'd known about it. She was going to see James Mitchell. Mrs. Chen had agreed to take Emma to Central Park for the morning, and Emma had carefully planned her route. She knew James lived in the tall building near the park because she'd seen it in a magazine at the doctor's office. She knew he was sad because he missed her and her mom. And she knew that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was ask for help. The doorman at James's building was initially skeptical about the small girl requesting to see the penthouse resident, but Emma's earnest explanation that she needed to talk to Mr. James about something very important eventually convinced him to make the call. "Mr. Mitchell? There's a young lady here to see you. Says her name is Emma Bennett." James was in his study, staring at a letter he'd started and discarded 17 times, an apology to Sarah that never seemed adequate, when the call came through. His heart stopped. "Send her up," he said immediately. When the elevator doors opened, James saw Emma standing there in her favorite pink dress, holding a small wrapped package and wearing an expression of determined courage that reminded him powerfully of her mother. "Hi, James," she said simply. "We need to talk." James knelt down to her level, overwhelmed by how much he'd missed this remarkable little girl. "Emma, where's your mother? Does she know you're here?" "Mommy's working," Emma said matter-of-factly. "And she's been crying a lot since you stopped visiting us. She thinks I don't notice, but I do." The words hit James like a physical blow. "Emma, I'm so sorry, that's what I came to talk about," Emma interrupted with the directness that had first captured James's attention. "You and Mommy had a fight about something that happened before I was born, right?" James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Well, I brought you something that might help." Emma held out the wrapped package. "Mommy doesn't know I have this. I found it in her special box where she keeps Daddy's things." With trembling hands, James unwrapped the package. Inside was a hospital bracelet, David Bennett, February 23, Metropolitan General Hospital, and a small, faded ultrasound photo. "That's my baby brother," Emma said quietly. "He was going to be born, but he went to heaven the same day as Daddy. Mommy was really, really sad for a long time." James stared at the ultrasound image, finally understanding the full scope of what Sarah had lost that day. Not just her husband, but their unborn child. While he'd been grieving Rebecca, Sarah had been experiencing a double tragedy that would have destroyed most people. "Emma," James said gently, "why are you showing me this?" "Because Mommy never talks about the baby brother. She's still too sad. But I think she's been sad long enough. And I think you've been sad long enough too." Emma reached into her small purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's something else. I found this in Daddy's things. Mommy doesn't know about this either." James unfolded the paper and felt his world shift. It was a handwritten letter from David to Sarah, clearly written during his final days in the hospital. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing the hardest thing anyone should ever have to face. I need you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. But Sarah, I also need you to promise me something. Promise me you won't let grief define the rest of your life. Promise me you'll be brave enough to love again when the right person comes along. You have so much love to give, and Emma needs to see that it's possible to find happiness after loss. Don't honor my memory by staying sad forever. Honor it by living fully, by loving completely, by showing our daughter that love is stronger than loss. Find someone who sees how extraordinary you are, and don't be afraid to let them into your heart. I'll always be with you, but I want you to find someone who can be with you in all the ways I can't be anymore. Love always, David." Tears were streaming down James's face as he finished reading. "Emma, this is beautiful, but I don't understand why you're showing it to me." Emma climbed onto the couch beside him and looked at him with eyes that seemed far too wise for her 6 years. "Because Daddy wanted Mommy to find someone who sees how extraordinary she is. And you do, don't you? Yes, James whispered. I do. And Mommy loves you. I can tell because she gets the same look she used to get when she talked about Daddy. Happy and sad at the same time. James pulled Emma into a gentle hug. You're a very smart little girl. And very brave. So are you going to fix this? Emma asked with the confidence of someone who believed that adults could solve any problem if they just tried hard enough. James thought about everything that had happened, his accusations, Sarah's hurt, the weeks they'd spent apart when they could have been healing together. Then he thought about Rebecca's own words about not wasting life on grief, and David's letter encouraging Sarah to love again. Yes, James said firmly. I'm going to fix this. But I'm going to need your help. 2 hours later, Sarah returned from her shift at the grocery store to find Mrs. Chen waiting in the hallway with an expression of barely contained excitement. Sarah, dear, Emma had a wonderful time at the park today. She made some new friends. Sarah unlocked her apartment door, calling for Emma. Emma, honey, I'm home. What she found made her heart stop. Her tiny apartment had been transformed. There were white roses everywhere, dozens of them, and candles flickering safely on every surface. Soft music was playing from a speaker she'd never seen before. And in the center of it all, James Mitchell was sitting on her small couch with Emma curled up beside him, both of them smiling at her with identical expressions of hope. Hi, Mommy, Emma said brightly. James came to apologize. And he brought presents. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sight of the two people she loved most in the world sitting together, as if they belonged that way. Sarah, James said, standing slowly, I owe you an apology that's bigger than words can hold. I was wrong about everything. I let fear and hurt make me cruel, and I'm sorry. James, Sarah began, but he held up a gentle hand. Please let me finish. Emma showed me David's letter today. And I realized that we've both been carrying more grief than any two people should have to bear alone. But maybe that's exactly why we found each other. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sarah's breath caught. I'm not asking you to forget David or Rebecca, James continued, his voice thick with emotion. I'm asking you to honor their memory by choosing to live fully, to love completely, to build something beautiful from the pieces of our broken hearts. He dropped to one knee, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Sarah Bennett, will you marry me? Will you let me be Emma's father? Will you help me turn that empty nursery into a home filled with laughter and love and the kind of family Rebecca and David would want us to have? Emma bounced on the couch with excitement. Say yes, Mommy! Say yes! Sarah looked down at James, this man who had shown up in their lives like an answer to a prayer she'd been too afraid to voice. This man who saw her not as a burden or a charity case, but as someone worth fighting for. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, James Mitchell. I'll marry you. As James slipped the ring onto her finger, Emma launched herself at both of them, creating a three-way hug that felt like coming home. I knew it would work, Emma said with satisfaction. I told you that you could be sad together until you weren't sad anymore. And now you're not sad anymore. 6 months later, James and Sarah were married in the same ballroom where they'd first really seen each other. Emma served as the flower girl, proudly announcing to anyone who would listen that she had arranged the whole thing. The nursery in James's penthouse had been converted into Emma's room, complete with a reading nook where James read her stories every night, and sometimes, late at night, Sarah and James would sit together and talk about Rebecca and David, not with sadness, but with gratitude for the love they'd known and the love they'd been brave enough to find again, because Emma had been right all along. Love wasn't about replacing what you'd lost. It was about having the courage to believe that your heart was big enough to hold both grief and joy, memory and hope, the past that shaped you and the future that awaited. And in the end, that was the greatest gift they could give each other, and the most powerful lesson they could teach Emma about what it means to live with an open heart.